watching anything that just makes me want to laugh and laugh and laugh.
And yet they make money. All right, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast based on writers sitting around, perhaps beverage in hand, talking about anything and everything. We may use explicit language, but we're hardly the most obscene thing you'll hear this week or probably even today, so consider us PG-13. Your hosts today are John Schmidt, Karen Brenchley, Chaz Brenchley, and me, Dave Welsh.
This is episode 91.
A psychological model for character building. Okay, well, I was surfing about the net, and I don't remember how I came on it, but I found an article by someone with the delightful name of Kira Ann Pelican, entitled How to Create Compelling Characters. And what it happens to be is kind of a how-to article. It's on a site called Psyche, yes, thank you, which talks about how to use a modern psychology model to develop characters. So without further ado, her thesis is that you can use a scientific model to understand a fictional character kind of the same way you would with a real person and analyze them and take them apart.
Yeah, but she goes further than that. What she's saying is that you can use it the other way to create fictional characters.
Right, yes. And yeah, I was getting to that. Well,
I'm sorry. I've interrupted.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to outline the model so that our listeners have it in hand while we're talking. So the model she's referring to is the Big Five model. It was proposed by a couple of psychologists named Toops and Kristall. And what they did was a factor analysis of survey data of words used by people to describe other people. And they came up with kind of 5 axes that describe personality traits. And everybody lies on a spectrum, supposedly, of each of these 5 traits. They are extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and openness to experience.
And the reverses of those.
Of course, right, yeah. Introversion, disagreeableness, I don't know what the opposite of neuroticism is.
Emotional stability, I think.
Okay, and conscientiousness?
Sorry, what was that?
Conscientiousness.
Oh yeah, that's unconscientiousness, which is a word I've never heard before.
Well, and then openness to experience, is closedness to experience, or
closed to experience is what the article says.
Right. Well, I'm glad somebody else has read the article. Excellent.
I have in fact read the article.
Right.
Excellent.
So what do you think of the article? And have you ever used any of these techniques yourself?
Okay, so I am, as you know, a heretic. And whatever system or formula people use, I always say I don't do that.
Right.
And of course I don't do this. I mean, it seems to me to be an interesting way to look at characters, to analyze characters already extant on the page or on the screen. Because, I mean, that's what she does throughout the article. She's looking at particular figures from literature and film,
right.
and arguing or demonstrating how these measures can be applied to them, where they come on the spectrum.
Right.
Spectra, sorry. But I cannot wrap my head around the notion of my interruption, the notion that you could take this as a system and use it for creating characters in fiction. It's, I mean, this is just me. You know, I am not an analyzer. I'm not a plotter. I don't sit down in advance and work things out.
Right.
And I have been doing what I do for 40-something years, which means that I don't even remember how I do it.
Right. You are an inveterate pantser.
I'm an inveterate pantser, and it all seems to me, you know, my entire process has become so inherent that I cannot think about it in these ways.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to me whatever.
Can you, as you said, can you take an existing character and analyze them using this and gain anything from it, or?
I don't honestly see where the gain would be for me.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting as a means to analyze other people's writing, if that's what you want to do. And let's be frank, I don't. But yeah, no, I see no value in it for me, either looking back or looking forward.
I see.
Which is not
All
to
right.
say that it isn't interesting. You know, I don't want to diss it at all,
Right.
because I read the article with a great deal of interest.
Right.
It's just
Well,
so removed from the way I do things.
Right.
It doesn't touch at any point. Also, the other thing I want to argue with her. Can we get her on the show?
well, that was another thing we will try, I suppose, and
Yeah.
it would be very interesting to talk with her and,
It will be
argue
fascinating
with her.
to talk to her.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to argue with her with one of her basic principles, which apparently is a basic principle across psychology. So I have to argue with an entire.
Well, I'm the one here with a psychology degree, so I'll
Oh
stand
right,
in.
yeah. So these big five measures of personality or character or whatever it's officially called.
Right.
She says they are all seen as individual and separate and not influencing each other, which seems total nonsense. I mean, my introversion is extremely affected by my neuroticism, and my neuroticism by my introversion. You know, the two feed off each other, absolutely.
Right.
And you can't say they measure independently.
All right. Well, let me. You've touched on two things that I can kill with one stone here. So I think it's a model. It's I mean, obviously it is a model, but her use of it as a model for character building is meant as a starting point, and you're probably not her target audience.
I totally
Writers who are much less experienced and have trouble getting started understanding characters are probably her audience. And as a model, touching on your second point, it simplifies, right? So the reason she is able to say, I assume, I'm not terribly familiar with this model, but the reason she's able to say that these axes of personality trait don't influence each other, it's a little bit circular, and she's probably got it kind of wrong in some ways. They are probably assumed not to influence each other for purposes of the model. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is you can't have a model without doing some simplifying. Now you can argue that this is oversimplifying, and that would be a very, very valid argument. But psychology is kind of squishy anyway. So if you can get anything that agrees with the data to, a correlation of 0.5 or 0.6, brilliant. So the reason that this is a modern and data-driven model is that they've actually done a factor analysis and
can you explain to the ignorant over here what a factor analysis is?
Yeah,
That an ignorant can understand.
Sure. In basic terms, you've got, well, if I understand what they did, they took a corpus of descriptions of people by other people, and they just separated all the words into into categories, essentially. And then you have, when you come up with these categories, then you do some AI or rather machine learning kind of jiggery pokery on it, and they kind of sort themselves. You have some kind of a metric that describes how close they are to each other and how orthogonal they are to each other and stuff, and you just crunch a bunch of numbers. That's what? Yes, right, exactly. Yes, so it would be very interesting to have her.
Yeah, I'm sorry. She has gone away.
All right.
She is not going to join us tonight.
Oh, well, we will revisit this modeling thing then at some point. But I mean, that's the basis of it, and it's a kind of the other thing to realize about this model from a machine learning or from a conceptual standpoint is that it's not a feedback model. There's no right or wrong answers. You're not getting. It's just taking the data and seeing what the data seem to be kind of telling you based on how you defined their distance from each other, their relationship to each other.
Okay.
And a lot of times what you'll do is, especially in modern AI is you'll start with thousands of factors, and you'll just run them through these enormous server farms, and it'll boil it down to the most important
Right.
most important factors. And a lot of times, some factors turn out to be equivalent to each other or very highly correlated to each other. So
Sure.
you combine them and stuff like that. And some
Yeah.
some are random, and you just drop those. So that's essentially what the factor analysis thing is about.
Okay. Thank you.
And so this leads me to a question. I looked at his method briefly, but I don't, whether I'm plotting or pantsing or just farsing around, I don't construct my characters to a framework. They are either people I talk to or set dressing that has certain characteristics, if that makes sense. So there are characters who are there carrying part of the load, and anything that I don't know about them, no one gets to see because it's not going to make it into the writing. What this seems to me to be is actually one step on the way to good artificial intelligence generated characters that will pass the uncanny valley test, which is essentially the Turing test, only you're watching a TV show and is that character real there, as opposed to a functional way for most of the writers I've talked to put characters together.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unfamiliar way to put characters together. It clearly seems to work for her.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that she has a cohort who do the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess another, I don't know if this is properly a criticism or not, but there's no real reason to, I mean, this is, let's just say for the purposes of argument that this is, or close to the most data-driven scientific model of personality that we have at the moment, right?
Okay.
There's no reason that you need the most modern data-driven model to write a literary character. I mean, it's just any way you can get started is a good way, and she introduces it as such, right? It's like, in fact, she talks about, what's his name, aspects of the novel by E.M. Forster.
E.M. Forster, yeah.
So, I mean, and apparently he talks about how to develop characters, and, writers have been talking about how to develop characters since there have been characters in writing. So this is,
it's a contribution to the conversation, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is an interesting one, and I'm slightly alarmed by John's pointing out that it's a sort of feeder into an AI character creation module, because that's going to put me out of work.
Well, not in your lifetime. Don't.
Well, yeah, okay.
Right.
But in the same way that CGI is replacing special effects created otherwise, I hope this doesn't happen. That the machines get better at what we do than we are. But I expect it will, and that's okay, because as you say, I won't be here.
I'm not so sure. There are already AIs that can write, for example, news articles reasonably well. But that's a pretty cut and dried type of writing.
Sure, but it's coming,
But
I don't know.
Another thing is, this wasn't really, it wasn't really her point. She wasn't saying.
No, absolutely it wasn't. She was proposing this as as guidance, as you say, particularly for writers early in their careers, as a way to enhance, to generate three-dimensional characters, what E.M. Forster calls rounded characters. And yeah, I mean, it's a very valuable contribution to the conversation. The fact that I myself, being 40 years ahead of her, gain no value from it is not to denigrate the system. For those who need a system, I think this is really interesting and accessible.
Yeah, I agree. Just tangentially, since that's what we do here.
It's what we do.
Yes, you are familiar with E.M. Forster. Can you expound a little bit on what he says about character development, just for my edification?
Obviously I can't, because aspects of the novel is probably the one book of his I haven't read.
Oh dear.
Because I don't do that. I don't do how-to books. I don't read them.
Well, it was written in 1927. Did you never
Yes.
read it when you were a baby writer?
I did not read it when I was a baby writer. I wrote when I was a baby writer. I didn't go to instruction manuals. I did my thing. I was throughout my teenage, I was confident that I was going to be the next J.R.R. Tolkien. And obviously, Ian Forster had nothing to tell me.
Which is actually a note I take. That was a what's the great comment on it? Somebody said everyone who's reviewed it said some of it's good, some of it's bad, but one of the wits said something about, what I learned is that he puts forward the way to write novels is like E.M. Forster.
Yeah, I have a strong feeling, having worked on one, that all the MFAs and all the Master of Creative Writing courses all across the Western world are teaching people to write one kind of novel. It's not a bad kind of novel, but it does mean that because it is becoming the case, at least in the literary world, that having an MFA is seen as a necessary step to getting published, which is bollocks. I mean, I don't even have a degree,
Right.
but because that is seen as a necessary step, therefore everyone is doing an MFA, and they're all getting the same essential thing. The same basic messaging. Less is more, I believe, is still current as the prime driver of how to write. I was the heretic when I was working on the Master of Creative Writing course in Newcastle. I would walk into a class and say, okay, everybody else on this faculty will tell you that less is more. And I am here to tell you that sometimes less is just less. Go big, and so on.
Yeah.
I do think there is a sameness that is infiltrating literary fiction.
How long has this been going on?
Well, in the UK, I would look back to we had when I was a student in the 70s. There were 2 creative writing courses in the country. It wasn't a thing in universities. And the famous one, the one at the University of East Anglia, which had Malcolm Bradbury, who was a top-notch novelist and screenwriter, running it. Famously, their first student was Ian McEwan, who is one of the leading novelists in Britain today. And that I think is when it started, because it became clear that the UEA course, was becoming significant in publishing. Agents and publishers were sending people first to talk to the students there, and then to recruit them.
Follow the money. It's all always follow the money.
A number of UEA students, I always get that wrong, got agents, if not contracts, before they left the course. And it was just a thing. And since then, certainly in the UK, I think there has been this creep towards the kind of fiction that is taught in college. And I don't know the course of the similar progression in the US, but I'm tolerably sure that it's the same sort of thing. I think you started earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Iowa, so there's the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, right? Which
I have heard of that.
I suspect is in many ways similar, but I don't know for sure. I don't have a literary career and did not
Right.
get an MFA. Among my master's degrees are no MFAs. I said follow the money, but I mean, I think if I'm channeling Jeannie here, Jeannie
Yeah.
usually hosts, so, and she would have blurted out follow the money, right? So,
Yeah,
so the publishers kind of flocking to the MFA programs.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, absolutely. Agents ahead of them. There is one agency particularly that has an intimate relationship with the UEA course, and scoops up several of its students most years. And yeah, I mean, that kind of thing becomes influential almost by definition, almost by default.
mhm.
Within that particular genre, that bracket of publishing. I mean, it is not as, it's still, as far as I'm aware, not significant in genre publishing, which is my place. Mostly,
Right. I was going to, yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's I'm just holding forth here.
Yeah, no, well, and you do so well, so I hate to
Yeah,
interrupt, but,
keep going. Loving it.
well, I do have a, regarding
yeah,
genre fiction, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, this is all true in the literary world, but what
Yeah.
about, popular fiction or genre fiction or, I mean, millions of books get published that aren't quote unquote literary.
Yeah,
And
no,
what's the
absolutely.
relationship?
It's a very closely bracketed relationship in literary fiction. I mean, certainly when I was teaching on a creative writing course, I was the only genre writer I knew who was teaching on any creative writing course across the country. There is a legitimate prejudice against genre fiction that
Yeah.
has inhabited literary fiction forever, and that prejudice has still not broken down. Brian Aldiss wrote a poem, which is 2 lines long, and I should be able to remember it, and I can't. But essentially what it's saying is...
Take your time. I cut out all the pauses in the...
Oh,
so
yeah.
it'll sound like you came up with it like that.
Okay, give me... no, I really can't remember. But essentially what it says is, if something's science fiction, it can't be good.
Oh.
So if it's good, it can't be science fiction.
Oh.
Except I'm pretty sure it rhymes, and I don't know how
Yeah.
he did that.
Well, that's a common logical fallacy, though.
Of course it is. Yeah. But it is nonetheless a mindset that is intimately familiar to those of us who've been working, at least in the UK, for some time. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. There are at least 2 MacArthur geniuses actively working in science fiction, and I love that.
Right.
There may be
Well,
more, but
Yeah, I mean, your hero J.R.R. Tolkien invented a genre. Is the Lord of the Rings and that stuff considered literature now, or is it genre fiction, or does it bridge the gap somehow, or what is?
It is certainly an area of study within literary circles in the universities. Tolkien studies is practically a subject in itself.
Mhm.
But I do not think, I mean, anybody studying Tolkien at university is not going to get points for studying his imitators and followers and disciples, which is, to some extent it's fair enough. But I don't know. I mean, there are science fiction courses these days. I'm tolerably certain there are people who've acquired master's degrees in science fiction and so forth. So there is some acceptance of the genre as an area of study, but that doesn't mean there is acceptance of the product as an element of literature.
Okay.
And I think you would find a lot of people still within the establishment who would argue very much against the
Turn up
admission.
their nose at
Yes.
genre fiction of any
Yes.
sort?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I took writing courses from somebody who went way back, from somebody who writes genre fiction and I believe was interested in it at the time and
Right.
wrote it. Bruce Holland Rogers. I hope I can get him on the show at some point. But
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess I kind of got the impression just from the couple of courses I took from him that yeah, this kind of snootiness, if you will, kind of exists. And I don't know. He was still early in his career, so it'd be interesting to talk to him about it. You know, what he decided to do. I know he got into short fiction for a while, and I think he's won a Nebula, so I'm sure he's into science fiction. So I don't know what he's done lately. I'll have to ask him. But yeah, okay. So all right. Well, we've talked about the industry and gone off on our tangent. I wanted to circle back and just talk briefly about other psychological models. This is basically just an excuse for me to dunk on the Freudian model, which I've always hated. It's a load of bollocks, as you would say. But it's another, and however, my point earlier that this isn't necessarily that having this, modern, quote unquote, modern psychological theory isn't really necessary. If you can come up with a good character with the Freudian model, good for you. For that purpose, it's okay. As psychology, it's bollocks, but
right, yeah, no. I mean, the whole point and purpose of creating characters is to put believable characters, people, on the page or on the stage or on the screen. And whatever route you take to get there, they don't have to be, they can't be accurate. They only have to be credible.
Right. And often accurate is exactly the opposite of credible in fiction, right? So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say, if that was written in a book, I wouldn't believe it.
Right.
We very much avoid, generally speaking, the extremities of human behavior because they're very hard to make credible within the psychological context of a character on a page.
Well, in a lot of regards, the character on the page is also a model and has to be simplified. I mean, you can't say everything about you can't even, if you imagine or write down a bunch of backstory for the character, you can't even fit all that in the novel, and that's a simplification, right? So
this is one of the differences between pantsers and plotters, I guess. I really hate pantsers. It sounds demeaning. I'm sure the word was created by a plotter.
Obviously,
yes. Well, Jeannie
but
uses it, so I blame her.
Yeah, sure. We can all blame Jeannie, especially if she's not here. I'd
blame her to her face.
Oh no. What am I saying? I am saying that
Pantsers versus plotters.
Yeah. There are some writers who will sit down and, in the same way that they will world build an entire planetary civilization, knowing that 90% of that will not make it onto the page, but needing it nonetheless to support their own notion of their own vision of the work.
Right.
There are people who will sit down with index cards or whatever the computer equivalent is, probably Scrivener these days, and create characters with so many details about the backstory and so on and so forth, and their psychology, to be sure, and so on, and knowing that 90% of that isn't going to make it onto the page, but feeling that they need to know that he went to boarding school and had a miserable time there, even though he's now 70 years old and and it's never going to be mentioned.
Right.
I don't do that.
You don't write it down, but I'm pretty sure you have it in your head to some degree.
No, really.
Really?
I mean, I create characters as I go along, in the same way that I build the world as I go along. When I need a thing, I find it. I mean, like the thing I'm working on at the moment, which started as a sort of notion for a short story that I could knock off in a few days, and then it went on, so it became a novella, and at the moment, technically, it's a novel. It starts with a discussion about the difference between grief and mourning. And obviously, it needed a character who was torn between grief and mourning. And her expressions of both were extreme and opposite. And that's a place I can start a story with someone who is torn between two completely different behaviors, depending on whether she's being overswept by grief or encompassed by mourning. And the whole thing built from that. And at the moment I'm loving it. And she has become a very complex character with a long backstory, which is all on the page. And an entire world with warring empires and so on and so forth has been built around her. And that's how I do it. It's a day by day ongoing process of building the thing that I need. Yeah,
I do a similar thing when I'm writing. I do try to, part of this is in the context of writing games. So for games, you do need to do a little backstory and world building just in case the players decide to do something unexpected, which they do. But yeah, I mean, when I write stories or fiction or I'm starting a game, I do much the same thing. I just start with an idea and develop it. I don't. A lot of times it's wordplay. I'll start with wordplay and it'll remind me or spark something, and I'll say, "Oh, that's kind of a clever notion," and just see where it leads.
Right.
But do you ever find that it leads you to a dead end? I mean, so I've been doing Sudoku puzzles lately, and if you screw up, you might as well just start over, right? So have you ever run into a Sudoku mistake in your writing where you've I'm not going to say pants because you don't like it, because you've improvised your way in a circle and run up against something that just can't happen?
Not exactly that. I have once in my life, I have started a novel with a brilliant idea and written it to a point where everything about the book was still interesting to me because I have this huge British Empire on Mars project in which I'm writing lots and lots of different things. This was supposed to be its first novel, and it ran into a place where it was becoming fascinating in a world-building sort of way, but really dull as fiction. So I thought, okay, I need to rewrite this completely, probably from
sort
the
of the
beginning.
Silmarillion of Mars, then.
Yeah, exactly. So I started rewriting it, and then I wasn't happy with that, so I started rewriting it again. I never do this. This is not what I do. I write first drafts straight through, and then I go back and meddle and fix things. But because I've started it at least 3 times now, it's completely stuck. And I may very well never go back to it at all, which is a real shame because it's brilliant. It's always the anxiety when you're pantsing. We need improvising. Let's say improvising. But it's not really improv either. We need a better word.
I just pulled that out of the air. Okay, well, your assignment for next time is to come up with a better word for pantsing so that we can throw it in Jeannie's face, because that's what I like to do.
Good plan.
Also, we'll post links to... Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have any... You have finishing thoughts? We're running out of time here.
Yeah, okay, I'll stop. I'll shut up.
No, you don't have to. I mean... She always does this so smoothly. We'll post links to all the interesting things we've referenced. You've been writing. You have been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our web, McGaffey Schwain, and our sound and engineer.
Dr.
And
McGaffrey.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Dr. McGaffrey. She's just Deirdre Schween now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Our web magic is, I have an old copy of the
Yes.
plate.
Our web magic.
Is brought to you by Deirdre Schwinn. I'll just record this later.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You've been listening to Writers Drinking. Oh. Go ahead.
You have been listening to writers drinking way too much, and you can tell.